Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here at ASCD. Virtual or not, I have been associated with this organization for quite a while, and it's nice to be back, and it's particularly nice to be back with Rebecca West Burns. And in our discussion about the new book with ASCD that just came out called Leadership for Learning, How to Bring Out the Best in Every Teacher. I'm just going to take a few moments to give you some background, because Rebecca's part of this is a very practical application of what you might learn from what you're already doing, or what you possibly could improve at, or what you could start in terms of professional development in how people work with teachers, both in peer settings or in more formal supervisory and administrative settings, where the focus really is on how do we improve our craft of teaching, and how do we constantly improve how students learn from us. In saying that, the origins of this book date back to 1981, and it was called Developmental Supervision, Alternative Approaches to Helping Teachers Improve Instruction, which was with ASCD. And it came out of my own experiences as a school principal, working with a much older staff. This was back in the late 70s, where I was a school principal, and I couldn't understand why, at that time, I couldn't understand why teachers would respond so differently to me when I would use the same approach with everyone. I tried to be collaborative and problem solving, and some teachers found it really helpful. Other teachers found it as a waste of time. Other people felt that I was just being wishy-washy when I just tell them explicitly what they need to do. And so later, after I left the principalship, I had the opportunity to go to the University of Georgia and spend many, many years in studying this whole differences of interpersonal approaches to teachers that are helpful and what are actually impediments to their improvement. Some of that work I do with my colleague Ed Paycheck, and it involved literally hundreds of schools. And now that I've been around for a while, and my writings have been out for a while, all of this seems pretty obvious, but all of us are different in how we develop and how we are professionally, and how we think about our work, and what kind of commitments do we make to constantly improving our work, and what are the thought processes that go into figuring out what would be the next step in our own improvement. Then, at that time, I really talked about 4 different approaches: non-directive approaches, collaborative approaches, directive informational approaches, and directive controlling approaches, which runs a whole spectrum, giving more and more responsibility on the non-directive side for teachers coming out with their own plans and their own thoughts, and on the directive side being with those who are supervising or peer coaching someone else, is much more laying out the information of what the teacher needs and how they can start to pilot certain steps that I, as their supervisor or department head or grade level head or school principal or whatever role could be used to help them. And Rebecca West Burns took my work as a basis for her work, which was to take those approaches, going from non-directive to directive, and layering on top of them the types of interpersonal behaviors, both verbal and nonverbal, that are enhancing teachers' thinking and teachers' commitment, or are impeding them. And thus, when I had an opportunity to do some future writing, I immediately went to Rebecca, who I didn't know that well, but I certainly respected her work and the years of work that she's done in schools itself, and her own studies and her own applications and pilots. And I asked her if she would not only work with me, but if she could help bring my original work into a whole new level, which she has completely done. So this book is what I call a one-shop stop. It lays out the different kinds of approaches, the strategies, the different kind of formats and protocols that can be used in schools, and also lays out the very different continuums of behaviors and that are also respectful of the kind of diversity and ways that we operate as different from each other, and also ways that our own development is in bursts. Is that we're not the same person when we're 25 as we are when we're 40, or how we are when we're 55, nor are our experiences shaped the same way. So given that as sort of the setting for what's to follow, again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I now turn this over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Carl. I also am very, very excited to be here to ASCD. This is my first time coming to ASCD, although I've been a longtime member of the organization. And I'm just very excited to share with you information about Carl's and my book that came out last year in 2020, Leadership for Learning, How to Bring Out the Best in Every Teacher. But before we get started, what we'd like you to do is take a moment to think about, why did you enter education? And why did you want to be a leader? If you want, you can use the chat, but you don't have to. But I want you to just take a moment and think about those two questions. So Carl and I wanted to begin with these two questions because really they get at our why, our rationale, our reason for what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And we think that's important because when we talk about the book today, we're going to talk a lot about how leaders can reflect on their practice and think about their own strategies and work towards improving it. But always, we should always come back to our why it is we're doing what we're doing. What is it that drives us to get up every morning and to go to school and to work with teachers every single day? So remember what you wrote here. We'd also like to ask you this question. At the end of their time working with you, what do you want teachers to say about you, your time together, and your leadership? I'm going to pause for a second because I would like you to put, if you're willing and you feel comfortable, to respond to that question in the chat. What do you want teachers to say about you, your time together with them, and your leadership? So this question and the ones before are listed in our book, and they are part of our spouse platform. And so we ask leaders to do that, to really look inward, because it's important for a leader to be able to articulate their rationale, their why. How many times as a leader do we ever get asked to think about, well, why is it we're doing what we're doing? Or why did we make that decision? Or what is it that drives us? Or what do we want teachers to get from their time with us? So it's important to just take a few moments and really think about our why. After all, in the book, we have this chart that says, if as a teacher, I present the same lessons in the same manner that I have in the past. If as a teacher, I do not seek feedback from students. If as a teacher, I do not visit or observe other teachers as they teach. If as a teacher, I do not seek feedback, suggestions, and critique from colleagues on students' work. If as a teacher, I do not visit other schools, attend particular workshops or seminars, or read professional literature on aspects of my teaching. If as a teacher, I do not invite visitors with experience and expertise to observe and provide feedback on my classroom practice. If as a teacher, I do not have a yearly individualized professional development plan focused on classroom changes to improve student learning. And if as a teacher, I do not have a systematic evaluation of my teaching tied to individual grade, department, and school-wide goals, then I have absolutely no way to become a better teacher. So if we're asking our teachers to do these things, to constantly reflect on themselves, to reflect on their lessons, to determine whether or not they've met their objectives, to look at student work and the outcomes and the impact, we expect that from teachers because we expect them to grow. But how often do we turn that microscope on ourselves? And so what Carl and I wanted to do in this book was to help turn that mirror and that lens on ourselves as leaders and look inward. So we took this figure and we flipped it. And I'm going to read it to you because I want you to really think about this statement right now. So if, as a leader, I approach my work with teachers in the same manner that I have in the past, I do not seek feedback from teachers and their students, if I do not visit or observe teachers as they teach, if I do not ask questions about my leadership and use data to understand its impact on teachers, if I do not seek feedback, suggestions, and critique from colleagues on the work that I'm doing with teachers, if I do not visit other schools, attend particular workshops or seminars, seek additional degrees or credentials, or read professional literature and research on aspects of my leadership, if I do not invite visitors with experience and expertise to observe and provide feedback on my leadership, if I do not have a yearly individualized professional development plan focused on school-wide changes to improve student and teacher learning, and if I do not have a systematic evaluation of my leadership tied to student, teacher, and school-wide goals, then I have absolutely no way to become a better leader. And so really, that's what this book, Leadership for Learning, is about. It's about how you can look inward at your own leadership practice and work on improving it every day. There are 7 chapters that are in this book, and I'm going to move my video over here. Hopefully you can see. We have a QR code in the top. If you want to use your iPhone or turn on your camera and you just scan that QR code, that can take you to a link where you can get more information about the book. We also have a bit.ly, which is a tiny URL at the bottom of the page. You can certainly copy that link down, and that will take you directly to ASCD's homepage and then directly to this particular book, where you can find out more information about the chapters. And you can also get access to the study guide, which we have up there for you as well, in case you want to use that study guide with yourself, or if you get some of your friends together and you want to read the book and do a book study, that study guide is there for you as well. So as I mentioned, there are 7 chapters. You can see them on the screen. The first one's kind of an introduction to teaching and learning at whole. And then chapter 2 starts talking about structures professional learning, like co-teaching, inquiry, clinical supervision, and more. Chapter 3 gets into our technical skills. So observing, assessing, and evaluating instruction, which is a common practice that many of us do as leaders. That's probably the most common practice that we all do. Chapter 4 is talking with teachers, and that with is italicized intentionally, interpersonal skills for leaders. And that work is really what Carl was talking about in the beginning, about those interpersonal behaviors, which, by the way, his continuum of non-directive to directive was, when I remember the first time I read that, and it just spoke to me so much. It gave me language for thinking about, okay, how do I respond to the different teachers with whom I'm working? And how do I know when to do what? And so Carl's continuum really gave me a language for how I could think about my approach to working with different teachers. And so I still gravitate and use a lot of his tools and his language to this day. And we hope that by together and coming together, that chapter there, you'll see some of the things that I've added to it. I've taken Carl's interpersonal skills and I've started to create some decision-making flow charts. So we hope that you'll be able to use those tools as you work with teachers and you try to select which interpersonal behavior makes sense within a given situation. Chapter 5 is exactly that. How do we differentiate our approach? How do we help diagnose where different teachers are developmentally, given the current context in which they're situated? How do we bring all that information together and think about, okay, how should I approach this particular situation with this teacher? Chapter 6 is a new chapter called Immediate Response Skills, Making the Most of Teachable Moments. And these are teachable moments not with students, but teachable moments with teachers. And then there's chapter 7, which really, especially this last year, has been incredibly important about the social emotional wellness and how do we improve practice in just this absolutely bewildering time in which we find ourselves. So unfortunately, we can't cover the entire book today. And if you are familiar with Carl's work in the past, you might have some familiarity with some of the early chapters. And if not, please delve in there because there's so much good, rich information in those chapters. I love it. I use them all the time. I just reread them and think about it in my own practice when I'm working with teachers. But today, what we'd like to do is focus in on chapter 6. Those immediate response skills. Before I get to those immediate response skills, one of the things I would also like to share with you are just a few of the golden nuggets that I love about the book. So throughout the entire book, I think you'll find personal reflection tools that will help you critically reflect on your leadership. We've incorporated a lot of scenarios and vignettes that we think, or we hope, help bring the concepts to light. We've included lots of tables and charts to highlight key concepts, and I've included a few on the top of the screen right there. For instance, the one is the decision-making flow chart for the interpersonal approach. You'll see the second one gives some concrete language about, how do we differentiate our language if we're going to switch between directive control and directive informational. I know that was incredibly helpful for me when I was first learning the different approaches. I was thinking, well, how do you decide, like what makes it different in my language? And so we really try to tease out some of those words and those wording that you can use to help you differentiate between the approach that you're trying to use and align that to the teacher's developmental needs. And then, like I said, the last thing that I'm so excited about are those decision-making flowcharts, and I'm actually going to show you one of those towards the end today. So hopefully you will find those golden nuggets really helpful and really beneficial as you look at your leadership. Okay, so now let's get to those immediate response skills. What I'd like to do for you for the moment is to paint a scenario. So imagine for a moment you have walked into a 6th grade classroom in a middle school. It's a science lesson. The teacher is milling around the room. The students are gathered in desks, kind of like you see here. They're talking. There's kind of a buzz about the room. The students are learning about mixtures and solutions. And today they've been doing this experiment. I should say the past few days they've been doing this experiment to try to figure out a saturated solution. And so they've been adding a solute into the solvent, and they've been stirring it up. And then they've been recording how much of the solute it took for it to be fully dissolved, where they couldn't add any more and they could see some of the solute on the bottom. And what the teams are doing today is they're taking their data charts and they're going up to the board and they are inputting their data. And so as you're milling about the room, you see the teacher, he's floating around, stops at a desk, bends down, talks to some students, and you decide to just kind of come over and park yourself at a table next to some of those students. And then the students go up and they start to put some data on the board. And the teacher, okay, once all the data is up there, the teacher looks at the data and starts to, just kind of make sure table 6 has theirs up there, table 4 has theirs. But one thing you notice about the data is that table 3's group, their data is way off, way off. And so as the teacher starts talking and asking the students about their data, you notice that the teacher just glosses over table 3. You don't know why he did, but he glossed over that data and just kept going. What would you do in that moment? Think about that for 1 second, because that decision that you just made is what we're going to talk about right now. What would you do in that kind of situation? So as Carl mentioned, recent research has uncovered a new set of leadership skills that leaders can use to improve instructional practice during the act of teaching. So this is not, well, they can be used outside that when you're conversing them, but we're going to talk about them when they're used in the moment when you're in a classroom working with a teacher, just like that scenario we just presented. Leaders use these skills to break down the complexity of teaching for others by seeing and noticing a teachable moment for the teacher, not necessarily for the students, but for the teacher, and how the teacher could improve their practice at that time. We call these skills the immediate response skills, and there are 6 of them: noticing, ignoring, intervening, pointing, unpacking, and processing. We're going to break down each of those skills for you. We won't be able to give it all to you today, but we will try to give you just a little bit of snippet. So the first skill is noticing, and that's the ability to see an important moment in practice that could be an opportunity for teacher learning. So when we think about the scenario for a moment, everything I laid out to you were all things that you might have noticed. You might have noticed the kids talking, you might have noticed the data on the board, you might have noticed the teacher milling around, you might have noticed the kind of language the students were using to talk with one another, you might have noticed the distraction that happened on. All those things, what you see, that's noticing, including the data that were on the board that were incorrect. The second skill is ignoring. You've been thinking, ignoring, that's a skill? But ignoring is a skill. It's the ability to intentionally decide not to act on something you have noticed. So when you think for a second about that scenario and everything I painted for you, there are probably things that you would ignore, that you might not bring up, and there's a reason why you might not bring them up. We can't bring up everything we possibly see, especially for a new teacher, because we can overwhelm them with a list of things. It's just way too much information. So we might choose to ignore some of it and really hone in on 1 or 2 key things that are important to talk about from that given situation. We also might ignore because perhaps doing something else in that given moment would jeopardize a relationship or would jeopardize something else. So there's a reason that we as the leader choose not to act on something we have seen. Another reason we might ignore is because we just think that what just happened there was superficial and not worth bringing up. So those are just all some examples as why we ignore. The third skill is intervening. And this is the ability to take action in the moment to improve instruction to support student learning. Now, lots of different ways you can intervene. And again, I can't get into all of them right now, but one of the ways you could intervene is actually chiming in. Another way to intervene might be whisper coaching. We've seen that happen before, where you huddle up with the teacher and whisper something in their ear. That's a way to intervene. Leaders are also using different technologies like the Bluetooth or the bug in the ear technology, where if you notice something, you choose to intervene or say something to have the teacher take action in that particular given moment. So that's an example of intervening. The next skill is pointing, and this is the ability to draw the teacher's attention to the teachable moment. And so this is where you notice something and you notice that the teacher doesn't notice something and you want to draw their attention to it. So when we think about that scenario, perhaps the teacher didn't notice that the data on the board were incorrect. So if you chose to intervene, then you could actually point the teacher to those inaccurate data by saying, Mr. So-and-so, I see those data on the board. I'm looking at table 3 and I'm a little perplexed. I noticed that the numbers aren't quite the same as the other group. Do you notice that? So this way, what you're doing is you're trying to draw the teacher's attention to something that you notice. And you're trying to help them, give them an opportunity, almost like, passing the football to them or passing the baton to them, say, hey, take a look over here. We need to change the direction. Notice what's going on. And so you're doing it in a way that helps, kind of direct them, but that's not necessarily interrupting the lesson fully, or that's intervening in a way where the teacher might think, well, why is the leader or the coach or the principal stepping in on my lesson? So pointing is a way of drawing the teacher's attention to that particular moment in time. The fifth skill is unpacking. And this is the ability to break down that teachable moment for the teacher. So it's the ability for the leader, the coach, or the principal, the department chair, who's ever working with the teacher, to say, okay, let's talk about what just happened here. And let's talk about why this went on. And let's think about, well, why might the student's data have been, inaccurate? What could have led up to that? So the unpacking is really like helping the teacher understand what's going on in your mind and the thinking that's happening there to come out on paper or to come out for them. And the last skill is processing. And this is the ability to lead a reflective conversation with the teacher, to think about what happened, and then to really develop next steps. And then to process and think about, okay, well, if we were encountered in this situation again, what might we do differently? And so processing is really that reflective, it's really reflection, but it's helping work with the teacher and help them through that reflective conversation to understand what happened and then think about what do they do next time. So let's go back to that scenario of that middle school classroom where they were working on mixtures and solutions and we had that inaccurate data. Again, think about what we asked you in the beginning. What would you do? If you feel like it, you could put it in the chat, but that's purely up to you. So let's talk for a minute about how you might make this decision. So how do you decide when to use which immediate response skill? So in the book, we have a flow chart like this, and I'll try to walk you through a little bit of it. So in instance, we had that first, you noticed something going on. For us, it was noticing that the data on the board were inaccurate. So as the leader, you would ask yourself, is that teachable moment important or potentially important to discuss now or in the near future? If the answer was no, then you should ignore it and move on to the next thing. If the answer was yes, though, then you need to ask yourself, okay, is student learning being compromised? Well, then we want to intervene. If student learning wasn't being compromised, then we need to ask ourselves, well, is the teachable moment a skill on something that the teacher's currently working on? If not, we would ignore. But if it was something, then we would go on. So even if student learning wasn't being compromised, but it's a skill that the teacher's working on, then we would move somewhere else. Also, if the student learning is being compromised, you should ask yourself, is this something that the teacher is working on or should be working on? And if that's the case, we need to point to it. And then once we point to it, then we need to decide, okay, does the teacher need to understand why the rationale behind what just happened, why just happened? If they don't, then you can have a conversation at a later time. If they do, then you should use some whisper coaching or modeling at that given moment. So that might be a moment where if we notice that the data were up there, we could go up and whisper coach, or we could use that language I had said about drawing the teacher's attention to the board. But we can talk about why we did that at a later time. If the teacher doesn't have to understand the rationale, then you just ignore it. And we actually never even talk with the teacher about why we pointed their direction, brought their attention to that particular moment. But if they do need to understand it, then we need to unpack. So then we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is the teacher's developmental level? Are they functioning at a moderate to high developmental level, which we talk about in the book? If the answer is yes, then we'd want to use a collaborative or non-directive approach as we move on. If the answer is no, then we'd want to use a directive approach as we move through the flow chart. And then we ask ourselves, do the next steps need to be determined to change future practice? If the answer is no, then we ignore it. But if the answer is yes, after we unpack, then we process it. And so once we're now on the processing, meaning we've already described kind of what's happened, now we're talking with the teacher and having a reflective conversation and thinking about what are some concrete action steps that we might take the next time we get into a situation where the students are putting data on the board and the data are not accurate. What might we do to anticipate that, or what might we do if that gets up there to that same situation? And so you need to ask yourself as you're having this reflective conversation, is the teacher functioning at a moderate to high developmental level? If the answer is yes, then we use a collaborative or non-directive approach. And if the answer is no, then we use a directive approach. So this is just one example of a flow chart that we have in the book, but our goal is to try to help make transparent the decision-making that goes on in leaders' minds, because there's a lot happening when we're working with teachers, and especially when we're working with them in the moment, there's a lot of things we have to think about. And so this flow chart can help us navigate how do we use these different immediate response skills effectively to improve instructional practice. So just one last reminder, again, this is chapter 6, and it's those 6 immediate response skills: noticing, ignoring, intervening, pointing, unpacking, and processing. So again, we hope that you've had you're having a great conference. We're so thankful that you spent some time with us today. When we'd like to leave you with this quote from our book: "To be a good leader, you must know who you are as a leader and what you believe about the nature of teaching and learning. And you must continually reflect on your leadership practices to improve your skills." And we hope that as you are engaging in that reflective journey and thinking about your leadership, that you'll choose Leadership for Learning: How to Bring Out the Best in Every Teacher, the second edition, in your own leadership journey to improving your own skills as a leader. Thank you very much, and we look forward to answering some of your questions.